The message came in at 3:41 on a Tuesday, and Lieutenant Imogen Sarr was the only person awake who could read it. She had been awake because the night watch on the Coriant desk was the watch nobody wanted, and because she was 23 years old and had been in the Terran Standing Fleet for exactly 19 months, which meant she got the watches nobody wanted. The desk itself was not a desk. It was a curved alcove on the third tier of the signals deck aboard the flagship perihelion, with 2 chairs, one of which was broken, and a wall of screens that had shown nothing but background noise for the entire 19 months of her career. Coriant transmissions were rare. That was the whole point of them. The Coriant Ascendancy did not chatter. It arrived, it spoke once, and then it waited for you to agree. The screens woke up all at once. Imogen had been eating a cold hand pie out of a paper sleeve, holding it over her lap so the crumbs would not go into the console, and when the alcove filled with light she froze with the pie halfway to her mouth like a child caught at a larder. The signal came down in the Coriant fashion, no handshake, no carrier tone, no polite request for a channel. It simply took the channel. It pushed her ship's receivers aside the way a large man pushes past you in a corridor, without malice, without noticing. The characters began to assemble themselves on the center screen. Coriant's script was built in stacked rows, each row a clause, each clause weighted, so that the whole thing read like a ledger. Imogen had spent 4 years of university and 18 months of fleet school learning to read it. There were perhaps 600 human beings alive who could do it well. There were maybe 30 who could do it fast. She set the pie down. She put her hand flat on the console to stop it shaking. Then she read. The first row was the seal. She knew the seal from the archives, from grainy captures a dozen years old, from a lecture hall in Galway where a professor with a bad hip had put it up on the wall and said, quietly, "This is what it looks like when a civilization has decided that you are a number." 9 concentric arcs, broken at the top. The sovereign's mark. Not a legate's, not a governor's, not a praetor's. The emperor himself was talking. The second row named the recipient. It did not say Earth asterisk, and it did not say humanity asterisk. Coriant did not have a word for a species you were addressing. It had a word for a thing being weighed. The best translation she had was the mass under assessment, and even that was generous because the same word was used for ore. The third row was the arithmetic. That was the part that made her stomach go cold and small. She had read about the reckoning. Everyone in her field had read about the reckoning, but reading about it was not the same as watching it fill your screen at 3:41 while the ship's ventilation hummed and someone 2 decks down laughed at something, not knowing yet. The Coriant did not open with a threat. They opened with a demonstration of their working. Here was the tonnage the Ascendancy had brought. Here was the tonnage the recipient possessed. Here was the ratio. Here was the projected duration of resistance, in days. Here was the projected casualty figure for the recipient. Here was the projected casualty figure for the Ascendancy, and they always included that one, always, because the elegance of the thing was that it was so small. Here was the number of worlds that had received this same accounting. Here was the number that had chosen to test it. 31 worlds. 0. The fourth row was the demand. Imogen read it twice, and then a third time, because she was not going to be the officer who ran up to the flag bridge and got a word wrong. Cessation of all armed construction. Surrender of all vessels above a displacement threshold, the figure given in Coriant units, which she converted in her head and got something around the size of a customs cutter. Acceptance of a sovereign governor, resident, permanent. Tribute assessed at a rate to be determined by survey for a term of 400 standard years. Registration of the population. Retirement of the word Earth from official use, and its replacement with an index number, which the message helpfully supplied, because the Coriant were nothing if not thorough. And the fifth row was the courtesy. That was the part that would stay with her. Years later, when the whole thing had gone into the histories and the school books and the bad dramatizations, when people asked her what it had felt like, she never talked about the ships. She talked about the fifth row. The fifth row said, in the plainest Coriant she had ever seen, and Coriant was capable of enormous plainness, that the sovereign wished to spare the mass under assessment the waste and indignity of a war it could not win, that the demonstration fleet had been positioned where it could be observed rather than where it could be effective, out of consideration, and that a period of 11 days was allotted for the composition of a reply. They thought they were being kind. They genuinely, sincerely, without irony, thought they were being kind. Imogen Sarr sat in a broken chair in an alcove on the third tier with crumbs on her uniform trousers, and she understood something that all the lectures had not managed to put into her, that the Coriant Ascendancy had conquered 31 worlds and had, by its own accounting, killed almost nobody, and that this was precisely why it was the most frightening thing that had ever come near her species. They had not built an empire out of slaughter. They had built it out of arithmetic so overwhelming that slaughter became unnecessary, and then they had decided that this made them good. She hit the flag alert. Then she picked up the pie, threw it in the disposal, wiped her hands, and started translating. By 4:10, the perihelion's flag bridge was full of people who had not been asleep and people who had, and it was easy to tell them apart. Admiral Vera Oyalaran belonged to the second group and did not look it. She came onto the bridge in a uniform jacket over a sweater, which was a thing Imogen had never seen and would never see again, and she stood at the plot table with her hands behind her back and said, "Read it to me. Not the summary, the thing itself." So Imogen read it, out loud in the flat clause-by-clause way that Coriant demanded, in front of an admiral and a fleet captain and 11 staff officers, 29 minutes after she had first seen it, with her voice doing something unhelpful in the middle of the third row and then steadying. When she finished, nobody spoke for a while. Captain Dov Aristide, who commanded the perihelion and was famous in the fleet for talking too much, said, 400 years. 400 years, Imogen said. The term is renewable at the sovereign's discretion. That word is in the fine detail, sir. It's a legal formula. They use it for mineral leases. They're leasing us. They're leasing us, she agreed. Aristide laughed once, a short, unhappy sound. Admiral Oyalaran did not laugh. She was looking at the plot. The plot showed the outer system, and in it, quietly, patiently, sat the thing that had come with the message. The Coriant called it a sufficiency. It was a fleet, but the word asterisk fleet was the wrong shape for what they meant. A sufficiency was a calculated quantity, precisely as much force as the arithmetic said was required, and not one ship more, because to bring more than was required would be wasteful, and worse, it would be a kind of shouting, and the Coriant did not shout. This one had come out of the dark past the 9th planet 11 hours ago, and had settled into a wide, unhurried formation with its drives cold and its weapons stowed, and had done nothing at all since. 906 ships. Imogen had watched the count come up on the boards through the evening watch, the way you watch a storm build over water. 906 vessels, none smaller than a heavy cruiser, 3 of them of a class the analysts had no name for and only a length, 11 kilometers. 906 ships was, by the Coriant accounting, generous. Their own working, transmitted openly, unashamedly as a courtesy, showed that 412 would have been enough. "They've parked it where we can see it," Oyalaran said. "Yes, ma'am, that's deliberate, that's in the message." Imogen swallowed. "They say it's positioned to be observed rather than to be effective. It's of the closest human idea is a mercy. They believe that if you can see the arithmetic clearly, you won't force them to prove it, and if you don't force them to prove it, nobody has to die. That's what the reckoning is. It's not a threat, ma'am. In their own grammar, it isn't even in the imperative. She reached for it. It's an asterisk offer of a shortcut." Oyalaran turned and looked at her properly for the first time. She was a small woman with gray coming in at the temples and a habit of stillness that made people stop fidgeting when she entered a room. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" "Sarr, ma'am. Imogen Sarr, Coriant desk." "How old are you?" 23, ma'am." "Where are you from?" Imogen blinked. "Galway, ma'am. The coast road out past the docks." "And your family, are they there now?" "My father, ma'am, he teaches. My mother's at the Fife Yards hull inspection. My brothers," and here she stopped, because saying it out loud in this room at this hour, in front of this woman with that plot glowing on the table, made it real in a way she was not prepared for. "My brother's in the fleet, ma'am. Reserve, he's a fitter. He's 20. "Which ship?" "The kitchen table, ma'am." Aristide made a small noise. Oyalaran did not. "Then you understand what I'm about to ask you to do," the Admiral said, "better than anybody else on this deck." She put 2 fingers on the plot table and spun it, and the outer system slid away, and what came up instead was Earth, and the Moon, and the 6 great yard clusters that hung between them, and the long silvered chains of the reserve anchorages that ran from the Trojan points out to the belt and past it, all lit in the soft amber of ships at rest, ships in ordinary, ships waiting. It took the table a moment to draw them all. That was the thing Imogen never forgot about that morning either, that the plot table, which was a very good plot table, took a perceptible moment to draw them all. 11 days, Oyalaran said. "Lieutenant Sarr, go and get some tea, and then come back here, because you are going to help me write the reply." The Coriant had come once before. 12 years ago, when Imogen was 11 and living on the coast road, and mostly concerned with a dog named Rooster, and the fact that her school had a hole in its roof. A sufficiency of 290 ships had arrived at a place called Havern's Reach. Havern's Reach was a colony. It had been settled for 60 years. It had a population of just under 40,000, an economy based on deep-crust mining and a very good line in preserved fruit, and a defense force consisting of 4 armed cutters, 2 of which worked. It had a mayor. It had schools. It had a road that everyone complained about. The Coriant delivered the reckoning. The arithmetic was, as always, honest. It showed the colony that resistance would last approximately 6 hours, would kill perhaps 9,000 people in the first exchange, and the rest by attrition and life support failure over 16 days, and would cost the Ascendancy an estimated 11 casualties, none of them fatal. Havern's Reach surrendered in 41 hours. Nobody died. That was the horror of it. Nobody died, and the histories could not even give humanity a massacre to be angry about. The Coriant came down, and they were correct, and they were efficient, and they were not cruel. They took the ships. They took the census. They installed a governor who was, by all accounts, a reasonable administrator. They assessed the tribute. They struck the name * Havern's Reach from the registers and gave the place an index number. And they explained, patiently, to anyone who asked, that names were a source of unnecessary sentiment, and that the index was more accurate. The fruit still got harvested. The mine still ran. The children still went to school and learned Coriant and were taught the accounting, and were taught that the Ascendancy had spared their grandparents a war, which was true. And 40,000 human beings woke up every morning on ground that was no longer theirs, and the rest of the species watched, and Earth, which had a treaty organization and a squabbling assembly and an aging patrol force and no answer at all, did nothing, because the arithmetic said doing something would be suicide. That was the year humanity started counting. Not building yet, counting. There was a woman named Sophia Bezin who had been an actuary before she was anything else, a small ferocious person from Lisbon who worked for an insurance concern that priced the risk of orbital freight, and who had been seconded to a defense review because nobody else wanted the job. She spent 14 months on it. She did not write a strategy. She wrote a threshold. Her question was very simple, and nobody had thought to ask it in that form. She did not ask asterisk, how do we defeat the Coriant? The answer to that was, you don't asterisk, and everybody knew it, and knowing it had become a kind of permanent posture, like a man walking with his shoulders up around his ears. She asked instead, at what point does the arithmetic stop working for them? Because the reckoning had a weakness, and the weakness was that it was honest. The Coriant did not bluff. They could not bluff. The whole moral architecture of the Ascendancy rested on the demonstration being true. They brought a sufficiency, they showed the working, they invited you to check it. And that meant that if you could make the working come out differently, not by being braver, not by being cleverer, but simply by being a larger number, then the reckoning would fail, and it would fail in their own hand, in their own arithmetic, and there would be nothing they could do about it, because they had spent 900 years teaching 31 worlds that the arithmetic was the truth. Bezin ran the models. She ran them against every Coriant order of battle in the archives, against their doctrine, their logistics, their sortie rates, the volume of space they had to cross and hold, the losses their own accounting deemed acceptable, the losses their politics could survive. She was not modeling a victory. She wanted to be very clear about that, and she was, in a report that eventually ran to 900 pages and had a first page that said, in ordinary letters, "This is not a plan to win a war. This is a plan to make a war not worth having." She came back with a number. 50,000. Not 50,000 of anything in particular. 50,000 hulls above a displacement floor, with drives that worked, with crews aboard, with enough teeth that killing them cost something real. She was explicit that they need not be good ships. She was explicit that they need not be new ships. She was explicit, in a passage that got quoted at her for the rest of her life, that a hull with 1 gun and 40 frightened people in it was worth more to the calculation than a masterpiece nobody could afford to build 50,000 of. The number was the point. The number was the entire point. 50,000 was not a boast. It was a receipt, the price, worked out to the decimal, at which a Coriant sufficiency of any size their empire could actually project would look at Earth and find, in its own honest ledger, that the cost of taking it exceeded the value of having it. And the Assembly read her report and argued about it for a year and a half, and then did the thing that no one afterward could quite explain, and that every historian since has fought about. It agreed. 12 years. Imogen Sarr had been a child for the first of them, and a student for the middle of them, and a very junior officer for the last of them. And like everyone her age, she had never known any other kind of life. She had grown up in what people had started calling, without much affection, the slow decade. The school roof on the coast road had a hole in it when she was 11, and it had a hole in it when she left for university, because the money that would have fixed it went into a hull number stamped on a keel in a yard in Fife, and everybody in the town knew it, and nobody had ever quite decided whether they forgave it. Her mother had come home from the yards with metal dust in her hair for 12 years. Her father had taught 2 generations of children in a room with a bucket in the corner. There had been no new colonies. There had been no great works. There had been a tax that everyone hated, and shifts that never stopped, and orbital foundries burning steadily at the belt line, so that on a clear night you could stand on the coast road and look up and see, moving among the fixed stars, the slow, bright crawl of something being made. 50,000 ships. Nobody had ever asked the species to do anything that large. Nobody had ever asked it to do anything that boring, because that was the truth of the standing program, and the reason it never got a decent song written about it. It was not glorious. It was 12 years of welding. And at 3:41 on a Tuesday, an emperor who had never lost had sent a courteous, honest, well-meaning message to a world he had weighed and found light, offering it a shortcut, giving it 11 days. Imogen went and got her tea. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time she came back, which surprised her, and she thought about that all the way up the ladder. How you could hold the end of the world in your 2 hands and find, after 20 minutes, that you had simply started carrying it. On the flag bridge, Admiral Oyalaran was waiting with a blank sheet on the table in front of her. "The Coriant expect a formal instrument of submission," Imogen said, sitting down. "There's a required structure, acknowledgement of the accounting, acceptance of the terms, a statement of gratitude for the sparing of life. That last one isn't optional, ma'am. It's a grammatical requirement. You cannot construct a reply to a reckoning in their language without it." "Can't you?" said Oyalaran. "No, ma'am." The Admiral looked at the blank sheet for a while. "Then we won't reply in their language," she said. "We'll reply in ours." The reply took 4 days to write, and in the end it was 160 words long. Most of those 4 days were not spent on the words. They were spent in a windowless compartment 2 decks below the flag bridge, where 11 people argued about what the reply was actually asterisk for asterisk, and Imogen Sarr, who was the most junior person in the room by 6 years and 4 ranks, spent most of the first day saying nothing and taking notes. There were 2 positions, and they hardened fast. The first said, "Send them the number, 50,000. Send it flat, send it cold, send it with the tonnage annexed and the sortie rates and the whole file," because the Coriant were arithmeticians and arithmetic was the only language they respected. And the moment they read the true figure, they would run the reckoning again in their own hulls, and it would come out wrong, and they would leave. The second said, "They will not believe it." That was Aristide's position, and he would not let it go. "They've been doing this for 900 years, he said on the second day in a voice gone hoarse. 31 worlds, every single one of them at some point in the first week sent back a number, every single one. Half of them were lying. The other half were counting fishing boats. It is the most predictable thing a frightened species does. It inflates. The Coriant know that. Their own doctrine has a asterisk category for it." He looked at Imogen. "Doesn't it, Lieutenant?" She had not expected to be spoken to. She found the file in her head. "Yes, sir. There's a term. It translates roughly as..." She hesitated, because the honest translation was insulting, and she was aware of the Admiral in the corner, as asterisk the noise a small thing makes. "There it is," said Aristide. "We send them 50,000, and to them we're a rabbit screaming, and a screaming rabbit doesn't change the arithmetic. It just tells them the arithmetic is working." The room sat with that. Admiral Oyalaran had been quiet for most of 2 days, which was, Imogen was learning how she led. She let people run themselves out. Then she said from the corner without moving, "So we don't tell them." Everyone turned. "We invite them," said Oyalaran. Here is what humanity had built in the 12 years between Havern's Reach and the Tuesday of the reckoning. 6 primary yard clusters, Fife, Ceres Deep, Kerala Orbital, Bahia Nuve, the Luna South Chain, and the enormous ugly sprawling thing at the Trojan Point that everybody called the Rookery, and that had, at its peak, employed 140,000 people who lived their whole lives in a tin can with a view of a girder. 11,200 hulls built new. That was the number the Assembly liked to quote, because it sounded like industry, like achievement, like a thing you could put on a poster. The rest was less photogenic. 9,000 converted freighters, their holds cut open and reframed, their engines left exactly as they were because a bulk carrier's engines were, it turned out, perfectly adequate for a ship that was never going to chase anything. 4,000 ore tenders with a single spinal gun run down the axis where the conveyor used to be. 2,200 former liners from the Marseille run and the Ganymede packet trade painted gray, their staterooms turned into berthing for crews who slept 8 to a room that had once cost a month's wages a night. Passenger ferries, cable layers, survey ships. Tugs, thousands of tugs, and a tug, as Sophia Bezin had noted in an appendix that made 3 admirals furious, was an object with an enormous engine, a very strong spine, and no purpose in life except to push, which meant that if you bolted a weapon to it, you had a warship that could take a hit and keep station, which was the only thing the entire program actually required a warship to do. And then, because 11,000 new hulls and 20,000 conversions still did not get you to 50,000, there was the last and strangest tranche, the ships built by places that had never built a ship. Yards in Chittagong and Gdansk and Duluth that had made ore barges for a century and now made hulls. Aluminum smelters in Iceland running at 400%. A cooperative in Kerala that fabricated pressure frames in a shed and shipped them up on a mass driver twice a week for 9 years without missing a delivery. A retired shipbuilder in Sunderland named Win Hallett who worked out how to cut the frame time on a standard Corvette by 19% using a jig you could make out of scrap, and who mailed the drawings, unsolicited, to every yard in the program, and refused to be paid for it, and died 2 years before the reckoning came, and had a hull number named after her, and would have hated that. 50,000 ships, 12 years. 2.9 million people in the fleet at full muster, of whom fewer than 400,000 were career service. The rest were reserve. The rest were teachers and welders and paramedics and truck drivers and farmers who came up for 8 weeks a year, every year for a decade, and learned to run a damage control party in a hull that smelled of fish, because it had been a factory trawler until the year before last. And they had no names. That was the thing that nobody had planned for, and the thing that in the end told you the most about what humanity had actually made. You can name 100 ships after victories. You can name 1,000 after cities and rivers and dead admirals. But at about 6,000 the rivers run out. At about 12,000 so do the mountains, the constellations, the virtues, the gods, and the entire back catalogue of naval history. By 18,000 the naming board, which was a real board, with a real budget, and which became by the end the most complained about office in the fleet, had descended into arguing about obscure Latin words for courage. And then somebody in the rookery, a yard foreman whose name is not reliably recorded, got tired of waiting for a name for hull 21,447, and wrote one on the bow in white paint, and it was the name of the street he grew up on. The board fought it for a year and lost. After that the ships named themselves, and they named themselves after the things people were actually thinking about while they welded, and the registry of the Terran Standing Fleet became, quietly, over 4 years, the strangest and most beautiful document in human history. There were ships called Harvest Home and Long Meadow and Second Sunday. There were ships called Rooster and Grandmother's Hands and the Bus to Work. There was a heavy monitor out of Bahia called My Sister Is Not Well and I Am Going to See Her, which the registry shortened over its crew's furious objection to going to see her. There were 400 ships named after dogs. There was a corvette called Hole in the Roof, built in Fife by people who understood exactly what the tax had cost, and there were, in the end, 11 ships in the fleet named Havern's Reach, which the board permitted, because nobody in the board had the stomach to tell them not to. And there was a corvette, hull number 33,908, built at Fife, displacement 4,000 tons, 1 spinal accelerator, 2 point defense clusters, complement 214, and she was called the Kitchen Table. Her crew liked to explain the name to anyone who asked, and they asked because it was the only thing to do at a fleet bar. The story was that the yard shift that laid her keel had been arguing about names, and a fitter's mate had said that she didn't want a ship named after a battle, because she had never been in a battle and hoped not to be, and that if she was going to spend her 30s in a steel box waiting for something to happen, she wanted the box to be called the thing she was actually thinking about, which was her kitchen table and her mother sitting at it, and the fact that if all this worked, her mother would go on sitting at it. That was the ship Thomas Sarr served aboard, and he had been aboard her for 11 months, and he was 20 years old. Imogen called him on the 5th day, because the message went out on the 5th day, and because After that, there would be no more calls. He answered from a passage somewhere in the kitchen table's engineering spaces, with his hair flattened on one side and a smear of grease along his jaw, and the first thing he said was, "You look terrible. You look like you've been sleeping in a valve." "I have been sleeping in a valve." He rubbed his eyes. "Immy, is it true? They're saying the whole reserve's being called. The whole reserve. Chief says the muster order's already cut and they're just waiting on the flag." She could not tell him anything. She had 4 separate classifications hanging around her neck like stones. "I can't," she said. "That's a yes." "Tomas." "That's fine." He said it quickly, and she watched him decide in real time to be brave, and it was the worst thing she had ever watched. "That's fine. That's what it's for, isn't it? That's the whole." He stopped. He looked past the camera at something. Then he looked back, and he was 20 years old again, and he said in a much smaller voice, "Is it going to be a war?" Imogen Sarr, Lieutenant Coriant desk, 23 years old, sat in a broken chair in an alcove on the 3rd tier of a flagship, and told her brother the truth, because he had asked for it, and because she had nothing else to give him. "It's going to be a decision," she said. "Theirs, and we're going to make it as easy as we can for them to make the right one." "By showing them," he said. "By showing them." He nodded slowly. Then he grinned badly, the way he did when he was frightened, and said, "Then I'd better clean the ship." The reply went out at 1900 hours, Fleet Standard, on the 5th day of the 11. It was not in Coriant. Admiral Oyalaran had been immovable on that, and she had made her reasoning plain in a room full of people who wanted to be clever. If they wrote it in Coriant, they would have to write it inside Coriant grammar, and Coriant grammar had a shape for this conversation, and every shape it had ended in the same place. There was no way to say no asterisk in the language of the reckoning. The language had been built over 900 years so that the word would not fit. So they wrote it in English, and they sent it with a lexicon attached, and they let the Ascendancy do the translating for once. It read, "To the Sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy. Your accounting has been received and checked. It contains an error. The error is not in your arithmetic, which is sound, but in one of your figures, which is out of date. We do not ask you to take our word for this. We would not take yours. In 6 days, at a place and time given below, the whole of the Terran standing fleet will assemble in the space between this world and its moon. Every ship, not a demonstration force, not a sufficiency, all of it. Come and count. Bring your instruments. Bring your own observers, as many as you like, in your own hulls, unescorted. They will not be interfered with, and they will be given the tracks and the transponder keys so that they need not take anything on trust. Count us yourself. Then run your reckoning again, and tell us what it says. We will be standing where we have always stood." The Coriant response arrived in 91 minutes, which the analyst said afterward was the fastest signal the Ascendancy had ever been recorded sending, and which meant that someone over there had been so angry they had not gone through the proper channels. It came from Legate Asher, the herald of the sufficiency, and it was 7 rows long, and it was, in its way, magnificent. Imogen translated it, live on the flag bridge with her hands flat on the console. The legate acknowledged receipt of a communication from the mass under assessment. The legate observed that the communication was not in the required form and was therefore, in a technical sense, that the legate was pleased to explain at some length, not a reply at all but a noise, and that the 11-day period continued to run. The legate noted that the mass under assessment had claimed an error in the accounting, and reminded it that in 940 years of the reckoning, the accounting had been challenged on 106 occasions, and had been found in error on none. The legate noted that of the 106, 94 had involved an inflated declaration of force, and that the Ascendancy had a word for this behavior, which the legate then supplied, apparently for the recipient's education, and which Imogen translated flatly as asterisk the noise a small thing makes, and then, after a pause, corrected herself, because the legate had used a rarer form. "It's a stronger version, ma'am," she said. "It's the word for the sound a bird makes when a hand closes on it." "Charming," said Aristide. "There's more." The last two rows were the ones that changed everything, and she read them twice before she believed them. The legate stated that the invitation was noted. The legate stated that the Ascendancy did not require an invitation to observe, and that its instruments had been counting the mass under assessment continuously since arrival, and that its count stood at 4,111 vessels of consequence, a figure which the legate was confident the mass under assessment would find familiar. And then, the legate stated that the sovereign, having read the communication in the original tongue, had elected to attend. Not the legate, not a governor, not a praetor. The sovereign, Cesar fourth of that name, emperor of the Coriant Ascendancy, who had personally received the submission of 19 worlds and had not left the flagship of his own sufficiency in 40 years, was coming to Earth in 6 days to stand on a human deck and take the surrender of the species in person, because their reply had amused him, and because the custom of the Ascendancy held that a reckoning refused was a reckoning the sovereign must close with his own mouth. The flag bridge was extremely quiet. Then Admiral Oyalaran said, 4,111, and something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else. "That'll be the standing anchorages, ma'am," said the operations officer. "The Trojans, Luna South, the near belt, everything with a live transponder, everything that's lit asterisk. Everything we've been letting them see for 11 hours. Yes, ma'am. And the rest?" The operations officer looked at the plot, where the amber lights lay in their long silvered chains out past the belt and into the dark, cold and dark and quiet and patient, 46,000 of them, engines cold, transponders down, sitting in the places where they had been sitting for years, waiting for a muster order that everybody had privately hoped would never be cut. "The rest, ma'am," he said, "are exactly where we left them." Oyalaran straightened up. "Cut the order," she said. "Every hull, every reservist. I want the fleet in the muster zone in 5 days, and I want it done in the open, and I want the transponder keys in Coriant hands before the first ship lights her drive, so that when they count us there is not one single thing they have to take on faith." She looked around the bridge at all of them, and last of all at the 23-year-old lieutenant from the Coriant desk, who had read the reckoning at 3:41 with crumbs on her trousers. "He's coming to watch us kneel," she said, "so let him watch." The muster took 4 days, and people who saw it never really managed to describe it, which is why the accounts of it are all so strange. It began quietly. On the first morning, the boards in the Perihelions Flag Operations Center showed 4,111 ships, the lit ones, the standing anchorages, the fleet the Coriant had been counting with such confidence. And then, at 600, one by one, and then in tens, and then in hundreds, the dark ships began to answer. Imogen watched it from a jump seat at the back of Flag Ops, because she had no station there, and nobody had the heart to throw her out. The muster board was a great curved wall of numbers, and the number in the middle of it was the only one anybody looked at. By noon on the first day, it read 9,340. By the end of the first watch on the second day, it read 21,006, and someone had started making tea and had not stopped, and there was a queue. The board did not show ships as icons. There was no room. It showed them as densities, as a slow spreading stain of light across the plot, and the stain grew the way frost grows on a window, from the edges inward, until the space between the Earth and the Moon, which is a very large volume, larger than most people who use the phrase have ever really let themselves feel, began gradually to fill. They came from the reserve anchorages in the Trojans, where 19,000 hulls had been parked in long lines for 6 years with skeleton watches aboard and their reactors banked, and where the crews now came up in ferries, 40 and 60 and 100 at a time, out of 190 cities, and found their ships and lit them. They came from the Belt Line, from the sheds at Ceres Deep, from the drifting rows at Hygia that the yard crews called the Orchard, because, from a distance, the hulls hung in their moorings like fruit. They came from Fife and Kerala and Bahia, with the paint still curring. They came from Luna South in a stream that took 31 hours to clear the chain, ship after ship after ship dropping off the end of the mooring line and lighting her drive, so that from the surface of the moon, from the dome at Shackleton, where 4,000 people stood outside in the cold and watched, it looked like a slow river of sparks running uphill into the sky. And they were not beautiful. That is the thing the paintings always get wrong. They were oar tenders, with a gun bolted along the spine. They were freighters with their bellies cut out and armor plate welded on in overlapping scales like a badly shingled roof. They were liners with the windows plated over, and their names painted on in letters a meter high by somebody who was not a sign writer. They were tugs, thousands and thousands of tugs, ugly as boots, engines the size of cathedrals, and a hull built around them like an afterthought. Half the fleet had been something else last year. A quarter of it still smelled like what it used to be. There was a class of monitor, 400 of them, converted from grain haulers, and if you went down into their lower holds on a warm day, you could still smell the wheat. By the fourth day the board read 47,000 and was still climbing, and the space between the Earth and the Moon had stopped being empty. That was the part nobody could describe. From the ground, and every human being on Earth who could get outside was outside, for 4 nights, in the fields and the streets and the flat roofs and the beaches, which is a thing that has never happened before or since. From the ground it looked like this. The sky was wrong. It filled up. Slowly over 4 nights the sky filled up, not with a fleet because at that distance no eye can see a ship, with light asterisk. 50,000 drive plumes and running lights and the enormous slow flare of engines breaking into station, and every one of them tiny, and all of them together making a second Milky Way, a band of dust and glitter thrown across the dark where no band belonged. It moved. That was what got people. It moved very slowly in patterns, and it had a shape, and it was over their heads, and it was theirs. On the coast road outside Galway, a schoolteacher named Imogen Sarr stood in his garden at 2 in the morning with the whole town, in coats over pajamas, and did not say anything for a very long time. Somewhere in that light was his daughter. Somewhere in that light was his son. The tax, the shifts, the hole in the roof. 12 years of a small, hard, grinding sacrifice that had never once looked like this, that had looked, every single day, like a man welding a seam in a shed. He put his hand over his mouth. He was not the only one. At 400 on the 5th day the board stopped. Imogen was in flag ops again, on her 4th cup of tea and her 2nd consecutive watch, and she saw it stop, and the room noticed a beat later, and then there was no noise at all except the ventilation. The number in the middle of the wall read 50,111. "Confirm," said Admiral Oyalaran. "Confirmed, ma'am. 50,111 hulls answering muster, transponders live, drives lit, in station or coming to station. 91 hulls failed to answer, engineering casualties, 4 in dock with hull damage. 1 lost her reactor at Hygia 2 years ago and never got a new one. Everybody knows about that one. The rest are here." 2.9 million, someone said quietly from somewhere near the back. 2.87, said the operations officer, because he was that kind of man, and then, in a different voice, 2,871,406 souls, ma'am, underway, on station. Oyalaran stood looking at the number for a while. "Signal the fleet," she said. "Text as follows, begin. The count is complete. 50,111. There is no more to build and no more to bring. This is everything we have and everything we are, and it is standing between one world and the dark, which is the only place it was ever meant to stand. Continue. You will hold your fire. You will hold it if you are fired upon. You will hold it if the ship beside you dies. You will hold it until I tell you, and I do not intend to tell you. Continue. We did not build you to take anything from anyone. We built you so that nothing could be taken from us. Hold the line, stand your ground, Oilaran sends end. She turned away from the board. Now, she said, get me the transponder keys and let's go and be counted. Here is what a Coriant sufficiency does when it counts you. It does not skulk. Skulking would be dishonest, and the reckoning was at its dead black heart, an honest instrument. 906 ships came in from the outer system on a straight, slow, utterly contemptuous course, drives cold, weapons stowed, and they passed asterisk through asterisk the human formations through them, between the great slow shoals of tugs and grain haulers and gutted liners, close enough that on the kitchen table, a fitter named Thomas Sarr stood at a viewport in a passage. He was not supposed to be in and watched an 11-kilometer Coriant flagship go by 2,000 meters off the beam. Silent, gleaming, perfect, like a cathedral drifting through a scrapyard. They counted for 19 hours. They took the transponder keys. They took the tracks. They sent, as invited, 41 unescorted observer craft into the middle of the human fleet, and those craft flew where they liked, and nobody touched them, and one of them spent 4 hours station-keeping alongside a converted trawler out of Bergen called Small Hours while its crew, presumably, tried to work out whether the thing was real. And 19 hours later, the Coriant did something that had never been recorded in the whole history of the Ascendancy. They counted again. The analysts on the perihelion caught it from the emissions, the whole sufficiency going back over the same volume a second time, slowly, methodically, with every instrument they had. 906 ships rerunning an arithmetic they had never once, in 940 years, needed to check twice. They think they've made a mistake, Aristide said. He sounded almost gentle. Look at them. They think their instruments are broken. They're not broken, said Oilaran. No, ma'am. That's the trouble, she said. Praetor Jalurkan spoke to them on the second day of the counting, and it was the first time anyone in the fleet heard the voice of a Coriant war leader. Imogen took it at the desk. It came in as sound, not script, which was itself an insult. Script was for equals, for records, for law. Sound was what you used for animals and for the crews of your own ships. The voice was low and slow, and had a wet resonance in it like something spoken in a cave. Jal did not negotiate. Jal explained asterisk. He explained that the praetorate had completed its assessment. He explained that the mass under assessment had indeed assembled a quantity of hulls, and that the quantity was in excess of the Ascendancy's prior estimate, and that this was noted. He explained that the praetorate had examined the composition of those hulls, and had determined that 71% of them were of no military value whatsoever, that they were merchant frames, agricultural frames that many carried a single weapon or none, that their armor was decorative, that their crews were farmers. He explained, with what Imogen was quite sure was genuine puzzlement, that the mass under assessment appeared to have confused number with asterisk force asterisk, and that this was the error of a child who believes that a great many small stones are the same thing as a wall. And then he said the part that she had to make herself translate, word for word, in a flat voice, in front of the flag bridge. He said that the praetorate had run the engagement models. He said that, in the event of battle, the Ascendancy would destroy the human fleet. He said that it would take between 9 and 14 days. He said that Ascendancy losses were projected at between 460 and 710 hulls, of 906. He said that human losses were projected at approximately 2.6 million dead. He said that the sovereign wished it to be understood that the Ascendancy remained prepared to accept a submission, and that the reckoning stood. And then Praetor Jalur Khan closed the channel. The flag bridge did not move. It was Aristide in the end who put words to it, and he did it looking at the deck. 460 to 710, he said, out of 906. Yes, said Oyalaran. They'd win. They'd win, she agreed, and they'd go home with a third of a fleet, having spent 900 years telling 31 worlds that the accounting means nobody has to bleed. She let that sit, and every one of those 31 worlds would hear the number. That's the whole thing, Captain. That's the entire mechanism. He just read it out to us on an open channel because he thinks he's threatening us. She looked at the plot, and the enormous slow patient stain of light on it. He's not threatening us, she said. He's checking his work out loud, and he doesn't like the answer. The sovereign's barge crossed on the 6th day. By then the two fleets had settled into a geometry that anyone looking at it from outside would have found almost funny. 906 perfect ships, in a formation so exact it could have been drawn with instruments, hanging in a clean sphere of empty space 300 kilometers across, and around that sphere, filling everything, going out and out and out until the plot ran out of resolution and simply rendered them as a haze. 50,111 ugly, mismatched, welded, patched, repurposed, badly painted human hulls, in loose shells in no formation at all, engines idling, guns cold. Going nowhere. The Coriant had come to close a reckoning. They had ended up inside a sky. Imogen was on the hangar deck in her best uniform, which was her only uniform, with her boots done and her hands sweating, standing at the end of a line of officers. And she was there because she was the best Coriant speaker in the fleet, and because the sovereign's herald had made it clear that the sovereign would be addressed in his own tongue or not at all. 23 years old, 19 months of service, 9 hours of sleep in 3 days. Admiral Oyalaran stopped in front of her on her way down the line and looked at her, and adjusted the collar of Imogen's tunic with 2 fingers, the way an ant might. When he speaks, she said, don't soften him. Ma'am. Whatever he says, however he says it, don't make it kinder for us. Oyalaran's eyes were very steady. And when I speak, don't make it kinder for him. There is one thing that is going to happen in that room, Lieutenant, and it is that 2 peoples are finally going to hear each other exactly. That's your whole job. That's the only reason any of this works. Yes, ma'am. The barge came in. It was black and gold and shaped like a closed hand, and it made no sound as it settled, and the deck crew, 30 humans in scuffed coveralls who had been up for 2 days making sure the hangar was clean, because if an emperor was coming aboard, then by God the hangar was going to be clean, backed away from it and stood very straight. The ramp came down, and Cesar Val, 4th of that name, sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy, keeper of the accounting, who had weighed 31 worlds and never once been wrong, stepped onto a human deck for the first time in his life. He was enormous. Not tall, he was perhaps a head taller than Aristide, who was not a small man but dense, built low and wide and heavy, with a chest like the front of a ship and long arms and skin the color and texture of wet slate. The Coriant were an amphibian people from a world of shallow, warm seas, and up close you could see it. The fine iridescent seams along the jaw where gill plates had been, generations ago, and were now only a memory the body had not yet given up. He wore no armor and no weapon. He wore a coat of black scales sewn one over another. Each scale, Imogen learned much later, cut from the hull plating of a ship of one of the 31 worlds. A coat of surrenders, added to across 400 years and 4 sovereigns, and it was very heavy, and it rustled when he moved. He walked down the ramp and he did not look at the honor party. He did not look at Admiral Oyalaran. He looked at the deckhead, and the girders, and the scuffed non-slip on the deck, and the deck crew in their coveralls, with an expression that in a human would have been mild polite interest, the way a man looks at the inside of a barn. Then he stopped in front of Oyalaran, and he spoke, and his voice filled the hangar without being loud. Imogen translated. He asks whether you are the one who signs. Tell him yes. The sovereign inclined his heavy head very slightly and spoke again. A longer construction, 10 or 11 clauses, delivered without pause, and Imogen felt the shape of it coming and had to keep her voice flat. He says he has come a long way to give you a gift. He says the gift is that he will hear the submission from your own mouth, in this place, rather than requiring you to be brought to his ship, because a people should surrender standing in their own house, and it is the custom of the Ascendancy to permit this. He says 19 worlds have had this from him. He says none of them were grateful at the time, and all of them were grateful afterward, and that he has learned to accept this. Aristide made a sound. Oyalaran did not move. He says, Imogen went on, and here she had to stop for a half-second. He says that he has looked at what is outside and that he wishes to say, before anything else is said, that he has never seen such a thing and that he does not think anyone has. He says it in the ma'am, there's a grammar for this. It's used for natural phenomena. Weather, tides. He is calling the fleet a * weather event. Is that an insult? No, ma'am, Imogen said slowly. No, that's the strange thing. In Coriant it isn't. It's the word you'd use for something that happened without anyone deciding it, something that has no intention. He's not saying we're contemptible. He's saying we're not responsible. He thinks the fleet is something that happened to us. Oyalaran turned her head and looked at the young lieutenant, and something in her face changed. Then we're going to have to disappoint him, she said. Bring him to the flag bridge. The Perihelian's flag bridge had one long viewport, 4 meters by 1, on the outboard bulkhead. It was, from a naval architecture standpoint, a stupid feature, a structural weakness in a warship, put there against the objections of 3 separate design boards by a stubborn chief constructor who argued that people who make decisions about ships ought to have to look at the thing they are deciding about. Admiral Vera Oyalaran walked the sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy to that viewport, and stood him in front of it, and let him look. Earth was below and to the left, blue-white, small, cloudy over the Atlantic, with the Terminator crawling up over the coast of Africa. The moon was above and far off, and in the black between them, in every direction the eye could reach and further, hung the fleet. At that distance they were points of light. That was all. 50,111 points of light in loose shells, layer behind layer behind layer, out to a depth the eye could not resolve, so that the far ones were not points at all but a fine gray dust smeared on the dark. They drifted. They flickered as they turned. The nearest was a converted or tender 4 kilometers off the bow, close enough to see the weld lines and the enormous crooked lettering along her flank, which spelled out a name in white paint. Breakfast. The sovereign looked at it for 11 minutes. Nobody on the flag bridge spoke. Imogen stood at his left shoulder because that was where a translator stood, and she was rigid with the effort of not fidgeting, and she watched the side of his face, and she watched a 900-year-old empire meet a thing it had no category for. When he finally spoke, it was one word, and it was a question, and it was the only question that mattered. How many? Imogen said, in Coriant, 50,111. He did not turn. Your praetor's count, he said, was 50,080. 31 ships arrived from Kerala this morning, sovereign, she said. They were late. Their yard is slow. There was a long pause. And of these, said Cesarion, how many are true warships? Oyalaran, when the question was rendered for her, answered it herself, and Imogen turned it back into Coriant clause by clause, and neither of them softened anything. 11,200, said the admiral. The rest were freighters, tugs, liners, trawlers, and ore boats, and a year ago some of them were carrying grain. Your praetor is right about them, Oyalaran said. Most of them cannot chase you. None of them can reach your space. We did not give them the legs for it, and that was deliberate, and you may verify it in any hull you care to board. This fleet cannot invade anyone. It has no fuel train, no siege capability, no marine corps worth the name. It is not a sword, sovereign. We did not build a sword. We built a wall, and then we kept building it for 12 years until it was 50,000 stones high, because that was the number at which a wall stops being worth climbing. She let Imogen finish, and then she said, "You already know that, though. You ran the numbers again, twice. That's why you're here." The sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy stood at the viewport with his coat of surrenders hanging heavy on his shoulders, and he was silent for a long, long time. Then he said, 460 of my ships. At best, said Oyalaran. 710 at worst. He turned from the viewport at last, and his eyes, small, black, set deep, went over the human faces on the bridge one by one and stopped on the youngest, on the lieutenant standing at his shoulder with her hands at her sides. "Do you understand what that is, child? 906 is not a fleet. It is the asterisk fleet. It is what the Ascendancy can hold together across that distance for that long, and it took 11 years to gather, and behind it there is nothing but garrisons and grain ships and 31 worlds who have been told, every day for 9 centuries, that the accounting is never wrong." "Yes, sovereign," she said. "They would hear," he said, "that I spent 2/3 of the fleet, that I bled, that the arithmetic asterisk broke." He said the last word in a register she had only ever seen in liturgy. "There is no world in the Ascendancy that would stay in it, not one. Havern would be the first, and the rest would follow within the decade, and there would be 9 centuries of war where there has been none." He turned back to the window. "Your admiral is correct," he said. "You have made a wall out of grain ships, and I cannot climb it, and I cannot go around it, and I cannot leave it standing, and I cannot pull it down without pulling down my own house." And then he said, very quietly, and Imogen rendered it exactly, without softening it, the way she had been told, "I have been sovereign for 41 years. I have never once had to think about what to do." What happened next took 11 seconds, and there is still an argument about it. The official Coriant finding, published 2 years later, was that Praetor Jalur Khan of the Praetorate, war leader of the Sufficiency, observing that the sovereign had been aboard a foreign flagship for over an hour, and observing further a movement in the human formation on the flank of his line, a movement which was, in fact, a shell of 200 converted tugs rotating station, because their reactors needed to shed heat, which is a thing that converted tugs have to do every 11 hours, and which the human liaison had briefed to the Coriant 3 times in writing, concluded that an envelopment was in progress, and acted to protect his sovereign. The human finding was shorter. It said that a proud man in a beautiful ship had spent 6 days being counted by farmers and broke. The Coriant heavy cruiser vessel of the 9th Ark fired a single main battery discharge at 1447 hours, fleet standard. It struck the corvette kitchen table, hull 33,908, 4,000 tons, out of Fife, amidships at the frame line, and there was no wreck, and there was nothing to recover, and there were 214 people aboard. On the flag bridge, every alarm in the ship went off at once. Imogen Sarr heard the ship's name come over the tactical net, heard it spoken by a duty rating in a voice with no particular emotion in it, because he did not know, because to him it was one of 50,000 names and it had been assigned to him to read, and the floor of the world went out from under her. She did not fall down. She noted in some cold, remote attic of her mind that she did not fall down. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her face did nothing. 214 people, 11 months, then I'd better clean the ship. Around her the flag bridge went to war. She watched it happen, and it happened very fast, and it was, for 11 seconds, entirely out of anyone's hands. Fire control unlocked across the whole net, not by order, but automatically, because that is what a defensive fleet systems are for, and that is what they do when a friendly hull dies. 50,110 ships came awake. On the board, the enormous gray haze of the human formation turned, all at once, and every one of those ugly welded patched repurposed hulls put its nose on the Coriant sphere, and the targeting solutions came up in a cascade, so vast the plot could not draw them and simply turned the whole volume red, and the fleet net filled with voices, thousands of voices, all of them asking the same question in the same 3 words. Weapons free, weapons free, weapons free. 906 Coriant ships sat in the middle of it with their guns stowed. The sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy did not move. He stood at the viewport with his back to the human bridge, and he watched the sky he had come to weigh turn its face toward him, and Imogen, who would remember this for the rest of her life, who would be asked about it in 300 interviews and never once get it right, saw his shoulders go down. Not in fear, in something worse. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he knew exactly what it was worth, and he had, in that moment, absolutely no complaint to make about it. He had killed a ship of a people who had not fired at him in their own house, under a flag of parley, and the price of it was 906 hulls, and 41 years of his life and the ascendancy entire, and by his own accounting the price was fair. Admiral Vera Oilerin walked to the tactical station. She did not run. She walked, and the bridge crew got out of her way, and she put one hand flat on the console and leaned into the fleet-wide circuit, and Imogen watched her take one breath. "All ships," said Oilerin, "this is the flag." 50,110 ships listened. "Hold!" The word went out at the speed of light through 2.8 million people, most of whom had been farmers a year ago, half of whom had just watched a corvette die on their boards 4 kilometers or 400,000 kilometers away, all of whom had a firing solution and a hand on a trigger and every possible right in the universe. "Hold," she said again. "Guns cold, solutions locked out, nobody fires, nobody." And on the board, in a wave that started near the perihelion and went outward and outward and outward through the shells and the layers and the fine gray dust of ships at the edge of resolution, the red went out. It took 9 seconds. 9 seconds for 50,000 ships to take their hands off the trigger. Nobody fired. Not the breakfast, 4 kilometers off the bow with a clean line down the throat of an 11-kilometer flagship. Not the 11 ships named Havern's Reach. Not Hole in the Roof, out of Fife, whose crew had been drinking with the crew of the kitchen table 9 days ago. Not one of the 200 converted tugs whose heatshed rotation had started the whole thing, and who were, at that moment, the closest human hulls to the Coriant line. 2.8 million people held their fire over the bodies of 214 of their own, because a small woman in a sweater told them to, and because they had spent 12 years welding, and because they knew, every welder and farmer and truck driver and schoolteacher of them knew, exactly what the ships were for. The flag bridge was silent. And then Cesarine Val, sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy, keeper of the accounting, turned slowly around from the viewport and looked at Admiral Oilerin, and said one word in a voice that had nothing left in it at all. Imogen Sarr, whose brother had been dead for 90 seconds, translated it. "Why?" she said. The sovereign did not wait for an answer. He crossed the flag bridge to the tactical station, and every human being on that deck, without discussing it, moved aside for him, and he asked in Coriant for a channel to his own flagship, and Imogen relayed it, and the communications officer, white-faced, gave it to him. He spoke for about 90 seconds. Imogen translated it in a low, continuous murmur at Oilerin's shoulder, and afterward she could not remember doing it. Her hands were very cold. Somewhere behind her eyes a boy with grease on his jaw was saying, "That's fine, that's fine, that's what it's for." What the sovereign said was this. He identified himself. He invoked a formula that had not been used in 300 years, a thing out of the old law, a sovereign's word, which cannot be qualified and cannot be appealed and does not require the assent of the praetorate. He ordered the vessel of the Ninth Ark to vent her magazines to space, all of them immediately, and to power down her drive. He ordered Praetor Jalur Khan removed from command, placed under restraint, and held for the accounting. He ordered every ship of the Sufficiency to stow, physically stow, every weapon that could be stowed, and to open their gunnery bays to human inspection at any time and without notice. And then he ordered the fleet, 906 ships, the entire projectable strength of a 900-year-old empire, to power down its shields. There was a silence on the Coriant net. It lasted 3 seconds. It was, Imogen thought later, the loudest 3 seconds she ever sat through. Then the Sufficiency did it. On the plot, one by one and then in blocks, 906 of the finest warships in known space took down their shields in the middle of a fleet of 50,000 hulls that had just watched one of their own die, and lay there naked in the dark and waited. The sovereign closed the channel. He turned around. He crossed the deck to Admiral Oyalaran, and he lowered himself with tremendous difficulty, because his people are not built to kneel, and the code of surrenders weighed 30 kilos, onto one knee. The whole bridge stopped breathing. "He is offering the forfeit," Imogen said. Her voice came out level and strange. "Ma'am, this is, I need to be exact. This is the accounting turned around. He is saying that the Ascendancy struck an unarmed hull under parley and that by their own law the debt is measured in what it was worth, and that the debt is his fleet and his person and his life, and he is offering all three, now in this room, to be taken however you choose to take them. He says his ships will not resist. He says his people will not avenge him. He says his heir has already been signaled and will honor it." She stopped. "There's a last clause, ma'am." "Say it." "He says he does not ask for mercy, because he is aware that he has spent 41 years explaining to 31 worlds that mercy is what the accounting asterisk is asterisk, and he says," she had to stop again, "he says he has just this minute understood the difference." The bridge waited. Admiral Vera Oyalaran, of Lagos and of Portsmouth, who had spent 12 years signing off on hull inspections and reservist rosters and welding contracts, and had never in her life commanded a ship in a battle, looked down at the kneeling sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy for a long moment. Then she said, "No." And when Imogen had rendered it, "Get up," he did not get up. "Tell him," said Oyalaran, "that we do not want his fleet. Tell him we have nowhere to put it. Tell him that if he gives us his ships we will have to crew them, and we have no one left to crew anything. Every welder in this system is aboard a hull out there, and they would like to go home. Tell him we do not want his life. His life is of no use to anyone, least of all to the 214 people who are not coming back. Tell him we do not want his empire. Tell him we have never wanted anything of his." She crouched down. She put herself at his eye level, which no one had ever done, and which is the moment in the painting, and the painting is wrong about everything else, but it gets that right. "Tell him," she said, "that we built 50,000 ships so that no one would ever have to take anything from anybody again, and that if the first thing we do with them is take his throne, then we wasted 12 years and a school roof and 214 lives, and I will not have it. Not for him. For us asterisk." Imogen translated it, every word. She did not soften a single one. The sovereign of the Coriant Ascendancy stayed on one knee on the deck of the perihelion, and his great slate-colored head came down, and he made a sound that no human in that room could interpret, and that the xenologists argued about for a decade afterward, and that Imogen Sarr, who was standing closest, never once described to anybody. Then he said, "Then what do you want?" They wanted the names. It was not Oyalaran's idea. It was Imogen's, and she offered it in a voice she did not recognize, standing in the middle of a flag bridge with her hands shaking so badly she had to lock them behind her back. And afterward she could never explain where it came from except that she was 23 years old and her brother was dead, and she could not think of one single thing in the universe she wanted except for someone to know his name. "The manifest," she said. "Ma'am, make him take the manifest." Oyalaran turned. 214 names, Imogen said. "That's the forfeit, that's the whole forfeit." He reads them out loud in his own voice on his own deck in front of his praetorate, and it goes into the record of the ascendancy in the permanent form in script, not sound, and it stays there. Not a list of losses, not a tonnage, names, where they were from, what they did before the fleet, who they left. She was crying by then, which she did not notice for some time. "They've weighed 31 worlds, ma'am," she said. 900 years. Nobody's ever made them read a name." The flag bridge was very quiet. Admiral Oyalaran looked at her young translator for a long moment. Then she turned to the sovereign and she said, "That's the price. 214 names. Say them." He said them. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes, because a Coriant mouth is not shaped for human names, and he refused, absolutely and repeatedly, to be given a phonetic aid, and he stopped every time he got one wrong and went back and did it again until a human liaison told him it was right. He said them standing, on the command deck of his own flagship, in front of the assembled praetorate, with the human fleet on his view screens and the recording running in permanent script, and he had asked for exactly one accommodation, which was granted, that a human be present. So Imogen Sarr, Lieutenant, Coriant desk, 23 years old, stood at his right hand for 4 hours and 11 minutes and listened to an emperor say her brother's name. Sar Tomas, 20 years. Galway on the coast road of the world Earth. Fitter's apprentice of the yard at Fife where his mother inspects hulls. Brother of 1. Son of 2. 11 months aboard. He was the one who kept the water pumps running, and there is a note here in the ship's log from the engineering chief dated 8 days ago which says, "The boy will be good at this." He read the note. He read all the notes. Nobody had told him he had to read the notes. They had simply been in the file, because a ship's manifest has notes in it, because a ship is a place where people keep track of each other. At the end he was hoarse, and he stood for a while with his hands on the rail. Then he said, to the praetorate, in the plainest Coriant that Imogen had ever heard from any of them, "That is what a hull is." The compact was signed 11 days later, and it is short, and every schoolchild on 32 worlds can recite it. The Ascendancy withdrew from Havern's reach and returned its name. The reckoning was retired. Not softened, not amended, retired, struck, ended, with the whole 940 years of its apparatus dismantled and its instruments broken up, because the sovereign understood, as an arithmetician must, that an accounting that had been proved wrong once was worth nothing, and that a threat you cannot carry out is not mercy but a lie, and that his people had been living inside a lie for 4 generations and had been, all that time, quite genuinely trying to be kind. Tribute was abolished across all 31 worlds. What replaced it was an assembly, which met first at Havern's reach because the humans insisted on it, and the Coriant, to their credit, did not argue. 19 of the 31 worlds left the Ascendancy within 4 years. 12 stayed, and one of them was Coriant Prime's nearest neighbor, and it stayed of its own free will, which the sovereign said afterward was the only thing in his entire reign he was proud of. Earth gave up nothing. It kept its ships. That was not negotiable, and nobody tried to negotiate it. There was a clause that permitted permanent Coriant inspection of the standing fleet, any hull, any time, unannounced, and there was a matching clause that permitted the same the other way, and the sovereign signed both without reading them, which caused an incident with his own legal secretariat that lasted a year. And there was a final clause, added in the last hour, in Oyalaran's hand, which was not a legal instrument at all, and which the Coriant insisted on keeping in the document anyway. Neither party shall bring an accounting to the door of the other. If you want something of ours, ask, and we will consider it. If we want something of yours, we will ask. Nobody is required to be grateful. The fleet did not stand down. That surprised people afterward. There were 14 years of arguments about it, and there still are. 50,000 hulls is an enormous amount of steel to leave hanging in the sky when the war you built it for has been over since before it started. And there were assembly members who stood up every single year and pointed out correctly that the school roofs were still leaking. But the fleet stayed. Reduced, reorganized, 3/4 of it back to the reserve anchorages with skeleton watches and banked reactors. The grain haulers quietly handed back to the people who wanted to haul grain again, but it stayed, and it stayed at 50,000, and the number was written into law. Because the point of it had never been the Coriant. The Coriant had only been the first ones to come and count. Win Hallett's jig is still in a museum in Sunderland. Sophia Bezin lived to be 91 and refused every honor she was ever offered. And when they finally cornered her into a lecture hall in Lisbon and asked her the question, whether she had known it would work, whether she had ever, in 14 months of modeling, allowed herself to believe that a species could actually do it, she said the thing that ended up on the plinth. It was never a question of whether they would build the ships. It was a question of whether they would hold their fire once they had them. I could not model that. Nobody can model that. That part they had to be. Imogen Sarr went home in the spring. She took the train west and then the bus, and she walked the last part along the coast road with her bag on her shoulder, past the school with the hole in its roof, which had been fixed the previous autumn by a work party of 40 people who had come home from the fleet and had nothing to do and were, all of them, extremely good at welding. Her father was in the garden. Her mother came out of the house with her hands still wet. They stood in the small green space between the wall and the road, the three of them, and there was nothing whatever to say, and they said nothing, and the sea made the noise it had always made. Later, when it was dark, they went out and stood on the road and looked up. The fleet was still there. It always would be, in some form. On a clear night you could see it, the faint drifting powder of light strung across the dark between the earth and the moon, moving very slowly, going nowhere at all. 49,939 hulls now, and rising again as the yards made good the losses, and one of them laid down at Fife that January, 4,000 tons, one spinal accelerator, complement 214, carried a name that had been carried before, and would be carried again. And the fitters who built her had painted it on the bow themselves without asking the naming board, because the board had learned by then not to ask. Kitchen table. An emperor had crossed a very great deal of dark space with 906 perfect ships and a courteous, honest, well-meaning message, and he had ordered a small blue world to hand over its ships, its census, its 400 years and its name, and he had done it in the sincere belief that he was sparing them something. And humanity had answered him with 50,111 welded, patched, mismatched, badly painted hulls, crewed by 2.8 million farmers and teachers and truck drivers, built out of 12 years of leaking roofs and metal dust and grinding, unglamorous, ordinary work, and had not fired one single shot from any of them, not when they had him, not when he had killed their own. Not once. That was the reply. 50,000 ships standing still. They were not built to take his empire. They could not have reached it if they had tried. They were built so that no one ever again would find it worth their while to come and ask a human being to kneel. And the emperor, who understood arithmetic better than any living creature, had read the sum in the sky over earth and found it perfect and undeniable and pointed at nobody at all. He went home with all 906 of his ships, and his life, and his people, and the memory of a young woman's voice reading a manifest in his ear. And on a road above the sea, a lieutenant who was 24 now stood between her mother and her father with her head back, looking up at the impossible glittering thing her species had made, and she thought, "He asked us to give up our ground, and we told him what it was worth." Then she went inside, and sat down at the kitchen table and stayed.